The man called the police, his voice filled with anger. "Sir, a black guy is trespassing on my property." He pointed directly at Lucas, his eyes filled with contempt. "He doesn't belong in this neighborhood. He's trash. We don't need people like him here." This story is not just a confrontation between two individuals but a challenging journey to break down deep-rooted prejudices and rebuild a united community where understanding and respect overcome fear and discrimination. How will Lucas overcome these barriers? Let's explore this dramatic story together. Lucas Johnson drove his sedan through the Oakwood Lane neighborhood gate, feeling his heartbeat race as he approached his new home. The surroundings unfolded like a peaceful painting: classic-style houses with red tile roofs, rows of lush green trees lining both sides of the street, and neatly trimmed gardens. Everything radiated elegance, yet it also stirred a sense of unfamiliarity in Lucas. The car stopped in front of house number 52, a colonial-style home with a white balcony and a wide lawn. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to calm his nervous excitement. "Here we are, Grace," he turned to his wife, who was smiling gently beside him. "We've arrived." Grace placed her hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with encouragement. "Lucas, this is the result of all the hard work you've put in over the years. We deserve this." She turned to look at their little daughter Emily, who was engrossed in her tablet in the back seat. "Emily, look. This is our new home." Emily looked up, her eyes bright with excitement. "Our house is so pretty. Can I have my own room, Mom?" Her innocent question made Lucas laugh, easing some of his worries. "Of course, sweetheart. You'll have your room, and there's even a big garden to play in." Lucas stepped out of the car, the cool autumn air brushing against him. He paused for a moment, gazing at the house with pride. But almost immediately, a glance from a window across the street made him freeze. A figure stood there, peeking through the curtain, then quickly retreated when their eyes met. He was no stranger to looks like that: suspicious, scrutinizing, and sometimes prejudiced. Lucas said nothing, only sighed and opened the trunk, starting to unload the boxes. Meanwhile, Grace stepped out and stood beside him. "Don't let them bother us, dear," she spoke softly, her voice full of comfort. "We've worked so hard to get here. This is our home." Lucas nodded, lifting a large box. "I know, but you also know that living in a place like this isn't always easy. I just want things to go smoothly for our family, especially for Emily." Grace lightly touched his hand, her gaze resolute. "We'll make it. I believe in you, and more importantly, Emily will have a safe place to grow up." As they continued unpacking, a few neighbors began to appear. An elderly woman came out from the house across the street. She stood watching for a while before Lucas waved to her. After a few seconds of hesitation, she responded with a small nod. Lucas smiled, telling himself that was a good sign. However, other signs weren't so positive. Whispers from a group of people a few houses down could be heard as if they were discussing the arrival of the new family. Lucas could sense their presence, but he tried to focus on his task. Yet every time he looked up, the gazes from the windows around him seemed to bore into him. Those looks were not friendly but full of suspicion and judgment. He took a deep breath, telling himself that this was just the initial reaction. After all, a black family moving into a neighborhood predominantly inhabited by white residents would certainly draw attention. "Just smile and act like a good neighbor," Lucas muttered to himself, a self-reminder. When he returned to the car to grab another box, Lucas caught sight of a figure in the window of the neighboring house. It was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a face full of wrinkles. He stood still behind the curtain, his eyes following Lucas's every movement. Lucas looked up and tried to create a friendly atmosphere by waving, but the man, Tom Williams, didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes cold. After a few seconds, the curtain shifted slightly and then fully closed. Lucas sighed, his anxiety rising again. He was no stranger to looks like that. Throughout his life, he had often faced judgments simply because of the color of his skin. Yet he didn't let the discomfort take over. Lucas turned back to his task, lifting a larger box and walking into the house. Across the street, an elderly woman with silver hair stepped out of her house. She wore a light blue sweater, small but seeming determined. Lucas noticed her gaze was fixed on him. Not missing the opportunity, he smiled and waved. The woman hesitated for a moment, but then she smiled softly and gave a small nod in return. That small gesture made Lucas feel a little lighter. It wasn't a warm greeting, but at least it showed that not everyone here was distant. He turned back to look at Grace, who was standing by the front door. "Someone just waved at me," he said, trying to hide the excitement in his voice. Grace looked in the direction he pointed, seeing Mary Smith slowly walking back into her house. She smiled. "See? We're not alone. Just be patient, Lucas." But not everyone was like Mary. A few other windows shifted, and figures could be seen lurking behind the curtains, but no one stepped outside. A while later, Lucas heard the sound of a window slamming shut from a nearby house, the sound ringing clearly in the quiet air. Whispers echoed in the atmosphere as if people were discussing his family. Though he couldn't hear clearly, Lucas knew very well that he was the center of attention. As night fell, Lucas and Grace finally brought everything inside. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch amid a pile of unopened boxes. Lucas stepped out onto the porch, looking down the empty road of Oakwood Lane. The streetlights illuminated the neatly parked cars and the carefully trimmed lawns, but that peaceful setting seemed like a shell hiding the distance and coldness lurking beneath. Lucas felt the heavy silence from the surrounding houses. He knew he was being watched. Every little movement was being noticed. "They'll get used to it," he told himself. "They'll see we're human too, just wanting to live a normal life like anyone else." But in the house next door, Tom Williams stood silently by the window, his stern gaze fixed on Lucas. His face was tense, the wrinkles on his forehead deepening in the dim light. In his mind, prejudiced thoughts began to form clearly. Tom whispered, "They don't belong here." And from that moment, a plan began to take shape in his mind. Here is the next part of the text. That evening, Lucas stepped into the house, but his heart felt heavy. He knew those scrutinizing gazes from the windows wouldn't disappear overnight. And he didn't know that his first real challenge on Oakwood Lane would come sooner than he thought. Tom Williams closed the curtains, but his eyes remained fixed on the house across the street where Lucas Johnson was still moving items in. His face hardened, and his gaze was full of suspicion. He couldn't understand why a family like that would move into this neighborhood, a peaceful, tight-knit community that had remained unchanged for many years. Tom's breathing became heavier. His old memories resurfaced, making his mind even more unsettled. Tom sat down in the armchair by the window, his hands tightly clasped. He recalled the break-in that had happened a few years ago, an event that had altered the way he saw everything. That night, thieves had broken into the house next door while the homeowners were on vacation. Tom, who lived alone after his wife passed away, was the only one who noticed strange lights in the neighbor's house. He called the police, but by the time they arrived, the burglars had escaped, leaving the house in disarray and a lingering fear in Tom's heart. Since then, Tom had become vigilant about anything unusual. He observed every change in the neighborhood, from unfamiliar cars parked on the street to new delivery drivers. But this obsession didn't just stem from the break-in, it also came from the prejudices he had grown up with, the stories his parents used to tell about always being cautious around people who aren't like us. Tom stood up, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain slightly aside. Outside, Lucas was laughing and chatting with Grace while carrying a large box into the house. From Tom's vantage point, nothing was threatening about the scene, but in his mind, a voice whispered that the peace of Oakwood Lane was under threat. "He doesn't belong here," Tom muttered under his breath, his expression resolute. Unable to contain himself any longer, Tom picked up the phone and dialed 911. As the phone rang, his heart raced faster. 911, how can I help you? A professional female voice answered. Yes, I want to report a suspicious person in my neighborhood, Tom said quickly, trying to stay calm, though his voice still betrayed his tension. He's moving things into the house across from me, but I don't think he lives here. The dispatcher asked in a calm tone, "Can you describe this person and why do you think they're suspicious?" Tom hesitated for a moment, trying to come up with a concrete reason. "He's a black man," he said, but immediately realized that wasn't convincing enough. "I mean, he doesn't look like anyone who lives here." He's been moving things in all afternoon. Who knows what he's up to? Sir, the dispatcher continued, her tone still professional, moving items into a new home is not a criminal act. Did you see this person break any windows, climb through windows, or do anything suspicious? Tom felt frustrated, but he remained insistent. He doesn't belong here, he emphasized, his voice rising. We don't have people like him in this neighborhood. This is a quiet, safe place, and I don't want any trouble. The dispatcher paused for a moment, then replied with a hint of skepticism mixed with patience, Sir, we need specific evidence of illegal activity before we can send the police. Just because someone looks different isn't a valid reason to send officers. Tom felt offended. I'm trying to protect this neighborhood. Can't you send a patrol car to check things out? After a moment of hesitation, the dispatcher reluctantly agreed. Fine, we'll send a unit to check. But I want to remind you that making a false report can have legal consequences. Tom hung up, feeling a brief sense of relief but also a lingering unease. He turned back to the window, watching as Lucas continued unpacking. Grace stepped outside and exchanged a few words with him, both laughing and chatting happily. The sight made Tom even more uncomfortable. He's hiding something, Tom muttered to himself, his gaze more determined than before. Across the street, Lucas had no idea what was happening. But when the flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared at the end of the street, a sense of unease crept over him. He turned to Grace, frowning. Looks like something's going on, he said quietly, preparing for whatever was about to unfold. The flashing red and blue lights of the police car swept through the quiet houses of Oakwood Lane, drawing the attention of curious residents. Behind curtains, many pairs of eyes peered out. Lucas stood on the porch, his eyes fixed on the patrol car stopping in front of his house. Two officers stepped out, their serious demeanor and polished black shoes making distinct sounds on the quiet street. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, though he couldn't shake his disappointment. Grace stood at the door, her hands clenched anxiously, watching Lucas. What's going on, Lucas? She asked, her voice trembling. Lucas turned around, offering a reassuring look. It's fine, Grace. I'll handle this. You stay inside with Emily. He walked down the porch steps and approached the two officers. The first officer, Miller, was tall, with salt and pepper hair. He greeted Lucas with a calm voice, though suspicion was still evident. Good evening, sir. We received a call about suspicious activity at this house. Can you explain? Lucas kept a polite smile. Of course, officers. I'm Lucas Johnson. This is my new home. My family and I just moved in today. Officer Miller nodded, though his caution remained. Do you have any paperwork to confirm that? Lucas nodded slowly, pulling his wallet from his pocket and retrieving the deed to the house and his ID. He handed them over without hesitation. Here's the deed to the house and my ID. Everything is legal. Miller examined the documents carefully, his eyes scanning the information. Meanwhile, the younger officer, Daniels, remained still, his gaze never leaving Lucas as if searching for any sign to confirm his suspicions. Can you explain why we've never seen you around this area before? Daniels asked, his tone slightly sharp. Are you sure this is your house? Lucas turned to Daniels, his gaze not showing anger but rather the weariness of having faced questions like this before. I'm sure. My family and I just moved in today. If you need more confirmation, Lucas paused for a moment, considering his words, then continued in a calm but firm tone. I'm the new Sherry. Here is the continuation of the text. Miller froze, his eyes widening as he glanced at the documents again, double-checking Lucas's name. Sheriff, he repeated, his voice filled with surprise. Lucas nodded. Yes, I was recently appointed, and I decided to move to the area I'll be overseeing. I thought integrating into the community would help me understand the place better. Daniels, who had been skeptical at first, now looked thoroughly confused. He stammered, I didn't know. Sorry, sir. We're just following procedure. Lucas gave a small smile, raising his hand to reassure Daniels. I understand you're doing your job, but I hope this serves as a reminder that we should be cautious about making judgments based solely on suspicion without cause." Miller quickly returned the documents, nodding with regret. "You're right, sir. We apologize for the inconvenience." From across the street, Tom Williams watched through the curtains, his eyes fixed on the scene outside. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. "The sheriff," he murmured, his eyes widening in disbelief. What he had expected to be a small victory now felt like a quiet humiliation. As the officers left, Lucas returned to the porch. Grace stepped out, her face full of concern. "Is everything okay, Lucas?" she asked softly. Lucas nodded, but there was still a trace of disappointment in his heart. "It's fine. But clearly, not everyone here is welcoming us." Grace squeezed his hand, offering a gentle smile. "We'll prove that we belong here, Lucas. You're a good person, and they'll see that." Lucas looked around at the quiet street once more. The streetlights illuminated the peaceful surroundings, but he could sense the complexity hidden beneath the surface. "I hope so, Grace," he said quietly, his gaze distant. "But I fear this is just the beginning." Back in the house next door, Tom sat in the armchair, his hands clenched tight. Lucas's arrival had not only confused him but forced him to confront long-held prejudices. "The sheriff, huh?" he repeated, feeling as if he were caught in a difficult spot. But rather than accepting this, another flicker of doubt flared in his mind, a reminder that his suspicions might not have been completely wrong. Meanwhile, Lucas and Grace entered their home, ready to face the new day and the challenges they knew would come. The next morning, Lucas stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, trying to enjoy some peace after the tense events of the previous night. However, the feeling that he was being watched still lingered. His gaze shifted toward the house next door, where the curtains fluttered slightly. Lucas knew that Tom Williams was observing him. As the sunlight bathed the quiet road of Oakwood Lane, Lucas took a deep breath, deciding it was time to face this difficult neighbor. He set the coffee cup on the porch table, adjusted his cardigan, and then crossed the street. Tom Williams, standing in front of his house, stopped watering the plants as he noticed Lucas approaching. His expression was briefly puzzled but quickly turned serious. Lucas raised his hand in greeting, trying to keep his tone friendly. "Hello, sir," Lucas spoke. "I'm Lucas Johnson, your new neighbor. I thought we should have a word." Tom crossed his arms in front of his chest, his face cold. "The sheriff, right? That's what I heard last night." Lucas maintained a slight smile, nodding. "Yes, I'm the new sheriff in this area. I just wanted to introduce myself and clear up any misunderstandings that might have arisen." Tom snorted lightly, his gaze full of suspicion. "Sheriff, huh? I don't think someone like you would choose to live here. This neighborhood was peaceful before you showed up, and I'm not sure it needs any changes." Lucas paused for a moment but quickly regained his composure. "Mr. Williams, I moved here because I believe it's a good place for my family to live and grow. But I also think that every community, even this one, can be better if we work together and understand each other more." Tom frowned. "I don't need to change anything. I've lived here my whole life, and I know exactly what this neighborhood needs." Lucas looked directly into his eyes, his tone firm but still calm. "I understand you care about this place, and that's something I respect. But I also want everyone here to know that I'm not just their neighbor, I'm the one responsible for keeping this area safe." Tom scoffed lightly. "Well, that sounds nice, but I still don't think your presence is necessary." Lucas decided to change his approach. He looked around the neighborhood and said, "Did you know I'm hosting a community meeting next week? I'd like to invite you to join us. It will be an opportunity for us to discuss the things that matter to everyone in this neighborhood." Tom seemed slightly taken aback, clearly not expecting the invitation. "I don't think I need to attend meetings like that," he replied, his voice still cold. "I've been here long enough to know what's necessary and what's not." Lucas didn't give up. "I believe you have a lot to contribute. Your knowledge of this neighborhood would be valuable. I'd like you to join us." Tom fell silent, his gaze briefly betraying some uncertainty. But his pride and stubbornness kept him from relenting. After a few seconds, he grunted, "I've got things to do," and turned away, entering his house and closing the door without another word. Lucas stood still, watching Tom's door close. A part of him was disappointed, but another part understood that change wasn't easy, especially for people like Tom, who had lived a lifetime within their prejudices and fears. When Lucas returned to the house, Grace was waiting by the door, her eyes filled with concern. "Is everything okay, Lucas?" she asked as he walked in. Lucas gave a small nod, sitting down in a chair and sighing. "It's fine. But I think we need more time. It's clear that not everyone is ready to accept us here." Grace placed a hand on his shoulder, smiling gently. "You did well, Lucas. The important thing is you didn't give up. They'll see who you are and what you can do for this place." Lucas nodded, but in his heart, he was still thinking. He knew that the upcoming community meeting wouldn't just be an opportunity to introduce himself, it would be a test of this neighborhood's willingness to accept him. And he was determined that, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he wouldn't stop. Here's the continuation of the text. Inside his house, Tom sat silently in his armchair, staring at the wall ahead. Lucas's words still echoed in his mind. "A guy like him," he muttered, unsure whether he was doubting Lucas or his own thoughts. But deep down, Tom knew he had just met someone who wasn't easily shaken. Lucas sat at the dining table, his eyes distant as he gazed out the window while the morning sun gently lit up Oakwood Lane. Outside, the street was still peaceful, but inside him, there was no peace. The tension from the prying eyes and Tom Williams's reaction the night before was still fresh in his mind. Grace walked in, holding a hot cup of tea. She placed it on the table in front of Lucas and pulled a chair to sit across from him. "Lucas, I've seen you sitting here for an hour. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Lucas sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I'm fine, Grace. It's just, last night brought up some old memories." Grace tilted her head, her eyes showing empathy. "What are you thinking about? Is it the old neighborhood?" Lucas paused for a moment, as though searching his memories. "Yes, that place. It wasn't an easy place to live, but the things I went through there made me who I am today." Grace didn't say anything, just held his hand as a wordless comfort. Feeling her support, Lucas began to speak. He recalled his childhood, living in a small house on the outskirts of a small town. His family was one of the few black families in the area, and that made them the target of unwanted attention, the scrutinizing stares, the whispered remarks, and sometimes even open acts of discrimination. These were part of their daily lives. One particular event still haunted Lucas. When he was a teenager, he and a few other black friends were walking home after basketball practice. On the way, they were stopped by an older man who lived in the neighborhood. "What are you boys doing here?" the man asked, his voice accusatory. "Don't think I don't know what you're up to." Lucas remembered the humiliation of standing there with no way to defend themselves other than silently walking away. "We're just walking home," he and his friends tried to explain, but the man didn't listen. He called the police, and they had to stand there, enduring the suspicious stares of everyone around until the police arrived. Even though they hadn't done anything wrong, they were thoroughly checked by the police before being allowed to leave. "Things like that weren't rare," Lucas said, his eyes lost in the memory. "Every time it happened, I felt both angry and powerless. But at the same time, it made me more determined. I wanted to change something, not just for myself, but for others who had to endure the same injustice." Grace nodded, her gaze filled with empathy. "And that's why you became a cop?" she asked. Lucas smiled faintly. "Yes. I knew that if I wanted to change things, I had to start from within. But even after joining the force, I couldn't escape the skeptical glances from my colleagues and the public. They didn't trust me, didn't think someone like me could do this job well." Lucas talked about his early days on the force when he was given menial tasks and no one listened to his opinions. But he didn't give up. He worked hard, kept his calm, and proved his abilities through every action. One of the major turning points in Lucas's career was when he solved a big case where he stood up to defend a black family who had been falsely accused. The justice he brought not only changed many people's views of him but also solidified his reputation as a capable and determined officer. But no matter what I achieved, I always had to work harder than everyone else, Lucas said, his voice quiet. Every step forward had to be earned with patience and, sometimes, endurance. But that's also why I know I have to keep going. Grace squeezed his hand more tightly. Lucas, I know you've overcome so much to get here. But I'm worried that this place, it might be just like the old neighborhood. Maybe not everyone here is ready to accept us. Lucas turned to look at her, a gentle smile spreading across his face. I know, Grace. I don't expect everything to be easy. But I believe that if we're sincere and patient, positive changes will come. Grace nodded, but there was still worry in her eyes. I just don't want Emily to go through what you did. She deserves a peaceful childhood. Lucas looked at her, his eyes full of determination. Grace, that's exactly why I'm doing all this. I want Emily to grow up in a place where she doesn't feel different and where she's treated fairly. I'll do everything I can to make sure she gets that. Grace smiled softly, the worry in her eyes fading. I believe in you, Lucas. And I'll always be by your side, no matter what happens. Lucas nodded, his gaze turning back to the peaceful street outside. The memories from the past weren't just a burden, they were here as the next segment of the text. News of the police presence at Lucas Johnson's house quickly spread throughout the Oakwood Lane neighborhood, like a breeze carrying curiosity and excitement. Whispered conversations could be heard everywhere, at outdoor yoga sessions, in the small cafe at the end of the street, and even from balconies. The incident became the main topic in the neighborhood, dividing residents into two distinct camps. Mary Smith, the elderly woman who lived across from Lucas's house, was one of the few people who openly supported him. At a small gathering in a neighbor's yard, she spoke out in defense of Lucas. Lucas hasn't done anything wrong. He's polite and kind. I met him when he moved in, and he introduced himself very respectfully. A man standing nearby, holding a cup of tea, countered. But are you sure he's the police chief? Who knows if he's telling the truth? Mary looked straight at the man, her voice firm. If you don't believe him, why not ask him yourself? We're judging without evidence. That's not fair. Some people nodded in agreement, but others murmured in opposition. A young woman sitting nearby added, "This neighborhood has been so peaceful. His presence might disrupt everything." Mary raised an eyebrow, her gaze resolute. Peace doesn't mean it can't change. We can't build a community by excluding others just because they're different. And remember, Lucas is the police chief, that's an honor, not a threat. However, not everyone was convinced. Some left the gathering with clear discontent, including Tom Williams, who had remained silent throughout the conversation. He walked away, his expression cold. Yet within him, unexplainable thoughts began to stir. Elsewhere, a group of conservative residents had decided to hold a private meeting. They sat around a large wooden table with steaming cups of coffee and several documents spread out. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, with tension written on each face. Everyone needs to understand, a middle-aged man with silver hair said. Lucas's presence could change the rhythm of our lives. This neighborhood has always been safe, and I don't want that disrupted. Another man added in agreement, we need to act now before it's too late. Who knows what will happen next? Tom Williams sat in the corner of the room, his eyes focused on the table. He didn't speak, but his presence bolstered the others. Still, internally, conflicting emotions raged within him. He didn't entirely agree with the group's approach, but he couldn't deny that Lucas's arrival had made him feel uneasy. Suddenly, the door to the meeting room opened, and Sarah Williams, Tom's daughter, entered. She was a young, intelligent woman with a more open mindset than her father's generation. Sarah glanced around the room, her sharp eyes stopping at her father. Dad, what's going on? Why didn't I know about this meeting? She asked, her voice tinged with disappointment. One of the group members spoke up, trying to maintain politeness. Sarah, we're just discussing changes in the neighborhood. It's necessary to protect the community. Sarah crossed her arms and spoke with determination. Protect the community? Do you mean against Lucas Johnson, our new neighbor? Someone you know nothing about except for baseless prejudices? The room fell silent, only the ticking of the wall clock audible. Sarah continued, her voice resolute. We can't keep living in fear and conservatism. Lucas isn't the enemy. He's the police chief, and he just wants to live peacefully like the rest of us. Instead of opposing him, why not open our hearts and try to understand him better? Some in the room lowered their heads, unwilling to meet Sarah's gaze. Tom looked up, his expression wavering between shame and confusion. His daughter's words made him reflect. Sarah turned to him, her voice softening. Dad, I know you're worried. But I believe we can do better than this. Lucas isn't a threat, he's an opportunity for us to build a better community. Tom didn't respond, merely nodding slightly. Sarah left the room, leaving behind a heavy silence. Some began to whisper, but clearly, her words had made a strong impression. At home, Lucas could feel that he was the center of attention. Grace set a cup of tea down in front of him, her eyes full of concern. What do you think people will say after last night? She asked quietly. Lucas smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed inner turmoil. I'm not sure, Grace. But I know one thing, if we continue to live by what we believe in, no matter how many oppose us, there will always be those who understand. Grace nodded, though her anxiety was still evident. I just don't want Emily to be affected by all of this. Lucas took her hand, his voice warm. That's exactly why I'm doing all this, not just for us, but for her. Emily deserves to grow up in a place where she doesn't feel like she's different. Across the street, Tom sat in the live-in. Here's the next part of the text. The following days at Oakwood Lane unfolded with a mix of tension and anticipation. Rumors about Lucas organizing a community meeting to share his plans spread throughout the neighborhood. Some were curious, others remained skeptical, and many, like Tom Williams, were hesitant. But despite the mixed reactions, Lucas was determined to follow through with his plan. He knew that change couldn't happen from one side alone, and the only way to reduce prejudice was to create opportunities for everyone to participate and listen. The community meeting was scheduled for a weekend afternoon at the neighborhood center's hall. Lucas had taken care of all the arrangements himself, sending invitations, securing the venue, and arranging seating. Grace and Emily also helped, arranging the chairs neatly and preparing refreshments to welcome the neighbors. As the meeting time approached, the hall gradually filled. Some familiar faces appeared. Mary Smith entered with a warm smile, nodding at Lucas. Other people quietly chose seats, their expressions a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Tom Williams arrived later, sitting in the back row, arms crossed, his eyes watching warily. His daughter Sarah sat in the front row, giving Lucas an encouraging nod as he prepared to begin. Lucas stepped up to the podium, his face calm but his eyes filled with resolve. Thank you all for taking the time to attend today's meeting, he began, his voice clear and strong. I know that the past few days may have left some of you feeling confused or even worried, but my goal is not to cause any disruption. I'm here to live, work, and build a better community with all of you. Lucas presented his plan in detail and persuasively. First, he shared the idea of organizing anti-bias training for local police officers. I want to ensure that every officer in the area is trained to handle situations fairly and without bias, he said. I believe that a good police force not only provides security but also acts as a bridge to build trust in the community. Some people in the audience nodded, clearly convinced by the sincerity of Lucas's words. Sarah looked back at her father, hoping he would change his mind, but Tom maintained a neutral expression. Next, Lucas proposed a neighborhood security improvement plan, which included installing more streetlights, organizing volunteer night patrols, and setting up an online reporting system for residents to quickly report incidents. Security is something we all care about, Lucas said. I want to ensure that every family here feels safe and protected. Finally, Lucas emphasized the importance of building community bonds. He proposed organizing events such as street fairs, communal dinners, and sports days for both children and adults. I believe that when we understand each other better, our differences won't be barriers, they'll be our strengths, he concluded. After his presentation, Lucas invited everyone to ask questions or share their thoughts. Mary Smith was the first to speak. I think your plans are very meaningful, Lucas. I've always believed that our community needs fresh ideas like these. A middle-aged man stood up, still somewhat skeptical. What you're saying sounds great, but are you sure these things will work? And how do we know you won't just do things your way and ignore our opinions? Lucas smiled, responding calmly. That's a great question, and I appreciate you asking. I can't do this alone. I need support and input from everyone. I'm willing to listen, discuss, and adjust the plan to meet the real needs of our neighborhood. This isn't my plan, it's our plan. Lucas's words eased the tension in the room. Some people began nodding in agreement, while others quietly pondered. In the back row, Tom Williams sat quietly, his gaze fixed on Lucas. He couldn't deny that Lucas was persuasive and had a clear vision, but inside, he still felt conflicted. Could he accept such a big change? Sarah turned to look at her father, her gaze gentle yet firm. Dad, I think Lucas is trying sincerely. You don't have to decide right away, but at least try to open your mind. This is our chance to make this neighborhood better. Tom didn't respond, but Sarah's words made him reflect. He still had internal conflicts, but for the first time, he began to feel that maybe Lucas wasn't the enemy he had once thought. As the meeting concluded, many residents stayed behind to chat and learn more about Lucas's plans. He seized the opportunity to listen to their feedback carefully, jotting down every suggestion. The skeptical gazes gradually shifted to expressions of curiosity and even warmth. On the way home, Lucas glanced at Grace and Emily, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. We still have a lot of work to do, he said, but I believe this is a big step forward. Grace squeezed his hand and smiled. You did great, Lucas. I trust that with your sincerity, people will understand. Lucas turned to look down the quiet street of Oakwood Lane. The streetlights illuminated not just the surroundings but also the hope growing within him. Though the road ahead was still long, Lucas knew he was moving in the right direction. Let me know when you're ready for the next continuation. G room, his eyes silently watching Lucas's house. His daughter's words still echoed in his mind, making him question whether his prejudices were truly justified. That night, for the first time in years, Tom felt instability in the beliefs he had always held firm. Here's the next part of the text. The first community meeting after Lucas's event created a small wave in Oakwood Lane. Some residents began to change their views on him, but many still kept their distance. Among them was Tom Williams, who clung to his conservative beliefs. However, Sarah's persistence was gradually making an impact on him. Dad, I know you don't trust Lucas, but I think you need to meet him more to understand what's going on, Sarah said one evening as they sat in the living room. I believe that if you join the community advisory council he's setting up, you'll see that he genuinely wants what's best for this neighborhood. Tom frowned, his frustration evident. I don't think I need to get involved in things like that. This neighborhood has been peaceful for years. Sarah smiled gently, her gaze unwavering. You always say that you want to protect this neighborhood, but how can you protect it if you don't understand what's happening? This is an opportunity for you to voice your opinion instead of just standing by and judging. Tom fell silent, considering his daughter's words. After a long pause, he sighed. All right, I'll join. But only to see what he plans to do, nothing more. The first meeting of the Community Advisory Council was held in a small room at the neighborhood center. The council was made up of residents selected from different age groups and professions, ensuring a diversity of perspectives. Tom sat in the corner of the room, arms crossed, his cold gaze fixed on Lucas, who stood at the head of the table leading the meeting. Lucas began by reiterating the purpose of the council, to listen to and understand the issues within the neighborhood and then propose suitable solutions to build a more united and safe community. He then invited each member to share their thoughts and opinions. When it was Tom's turn, he slowly stood up, his voice tinged with skepticism. I've lived here my whole life, and I've never felt the need to change anything. But it seems now that change is inevitable. I'm still not sure if these plans are really good for this neighborhood. Lucas nodded, maintaining a calm demeanor. Thank you for sharing, Mr. Williams. I understand your concerns. But I'd like to ask, what is it about change that makes you feel it's a threat? Lucas's question took Tom by surprise. He stood silent for a moment, as if struggling with himself. Finally, he sighed and began telling his story. I used to have a good friend. He was my neighbor, and we lived next to each other for over 20 years. But one day, he was attacked by a stranger right outside his house. Since then, I've always felt that any change anyone new coming into the neighborhood is a potential danger. Tom didn't respond, but Sarah's words made him reflect. He still had internal conflicts, but for the first time, he began to feel that maybe Lucas wasn't the enemy he had once thought. As the meeting concluded, many residents stayed behind to chat and learn more about Lucas's plans. He seized the opportunity to listen to their feedback carefully, jotting down every suggestion. The skeptical gazes gradually shifted to expressions of curiosity and even warmth. On the way home, Lucas glanced at Grace and Emily, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. We still have a lot of work to do, he said, but I believe this is a big step forward. Grace squeezed his hand and smiled. You did great, Lucas. I trust that with your sincerity, people will understand. Lucas turned to look down the quiet street of Oakwood Lane. The streetlights illuminated not just the surroundings but also the hope growing within him. Though the road ahead was still long, Lucas knew he was moving in the right direction. Here's the next part of the text. The first community meeting after Lucas's event created a small wave in Oakwood Lane. Some residents began to change their views on him, but many still kept their distance. Among them was Tom Williams, who clung to his conservative beliefs. However, Sarah's persistence was gradually making an impact on him. Dad, I know you don't trust Lucas, but I think you need to meet him more to understand what's going on, Sarah said one evening as they sat in the living room. I believe that if you join the community advisory council he's setting up, you'll see that he genuinely wants what's best for this neighborhood. Tom frowned, his frustration evident. I don't think I need to get involved in things like that. This neighborhood has been peaceful for years. Sarah smiled gently, her gaze unwavering. You always say that you want to protect this neighborhood, but how can you protect it if you don't understand what's happening? This is an opportunity for you to voice your opinion instead of just standing by and judging. Tom fell silent, considering his daughter's words. After a long pause, he sighed. All right, I'll join. But only to see what he plans to do, nothing more. The first meeting of the Community Advisory Council was held in a small room at the neighborhood center. The council was made up of residents selected from different age groups and professions, ensuring a diversity of perspectives. Tom sat in the corner of the room, arms crossed, his cold gaze fixed on Lucas, who stood at the head of the table leading the meeting. Lucas began by reiterating the purpose of the council, to listen to and understand the issues within the neighborhood and then propose suitable solutions to build a more united and safe community. He then invited each member to share their thoughts and opinions. When it was Tom's turn, he slowly stood up, his voice tinged with skepticism. I've lived here my whole life, and I've never felt the need to change anything. But it seems now that change is inevitable. I'm still not sure if these plans are really good for this neighborhood. Lucas nodded, maintaining a calm demeanor. Thank you for sharing, Mr. Williams. I understand your concerns. But I'd like to ask, what is it about change that makes you feel it's a threat? Lucas's question took Tom by surprise. He stood silent for a moment, as if struggling with himself. Finally, he sighed and began telling his story. I used to have a good friend. He was my neighbor, and we lived next to each other for over 20 years. But one day, he was attacked by a stranger right outside his house. Since then, I've always felt that any change anyone new coming into the neighborhood is a potential danger. The room fell silent as everyone listened to Tom's story with empathy. Lucas looked at him and nodded gently. I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Williams. I understand why that would make you feel the need to protect your community. But I'd also like to share something. Lucas took a deep breath, his gaze becoming serious but still warm. I grew up in a neighborhood where people didn't see me for who I was but for the color of my skin. I was judged and rejected simply because they thought I didn't belong. But instead of letting fear control me, I decided to work toward changing that. I believe that connection and mutual understanding can break down the barriers we've built. Tom looked at Lucas, his eyes reflecting inner conflict. You think that just talking can change everything? Lucas smiled lightly. I'm not saying it's easy. But I believe it's the only way. Fear and prejudice only make us drift further apart. But if we listen and understand each other, we can build a truly strong community. The meeting ended in thoughtful silence. Some people stepped forward to thank Lucas for his sincerity, while others left without saying a word. Tom stood in the corner, watching Lucas talk with a few residents. He didn't know what to say, but Lucas's words had left an impression on him. On the way home, Sarah looked at her father, smiling. Dad, I think Lucas wants to do good. Do you see that? Tom remained silent, his eyes distant. Maybe I've been too stubborn. But if he does what he says, then maybe I'll give him a chance. Sarah took her father's hand, her smile radiant. That's all I've been hoping for from you. That evening, Tom sat alone in the living room, his gaze fixed on the window. The image of Lucas and his words kept replaying in his mind. For the first time, Tom began to feel that perhaps the prejudices he'd held for so long weren't the best way to protect this neighborhood. Here's the continuation. Another quiet night settled over Oakwood Lane. The street still retained its usual calm, with soft yellow streetlights illuminating the empty walkways. But behind that stillness, an incident was slowly unfolding. Lucas had just finished a long day with his family. Emily had gone to bed, and Grace was reading in the living room. He stood by the window, looking out at the street, feeling relieved that the recent community meetings had brought some progress. But the sudden ring of the phone broke his thoughts. Chief Johnson here, Lucas answered, his voice professional. Sir, we've received a report of a break-in on Oakwood Lane, a voice on the other end said. The suspect is believed to be hiding in the area. Lucas immediately assessed the situation. I'll be there right away. Stay in contact and wait for my instructions. Within minutes, Lucas arrived at the scene, where a team of officers had already been deployed. A resident had reported that their window had been broken and a shadowy figure had been seen trying to sneak in. The atmosphere was tense in the neighborhood, which had always been peaceful. Lucas quickly evaluated the situation and issued clear instructions. We'll split into two groups, he said to his team. One group will check the surrounding area to ensure the safety of the residents. The other group will secure the house where the break-in occurred. Make sure the suspect doesn't escape. As Lucas's team searched, a few residents gathered at a safe distance to observe. Among them was Tom Williams. He stood among the crowd, his gaze fixed on Lucas with an unreadable expression. Though he didn't say anything, he couldn't help but notice how Lucas was coordinating his team with professionalism and calmness. After a few tense minutes, Lucas's team discovered the suspect hiding behind a bush nearby. With skill and decisiveness, Lucas confronted the suspect, ordering him to drop his weapon and surrender. Under pressure from Lucas and the police team, the suspect eventually gave up without any resistance. Once the situation was resolved, Lucas conducted a final check of the area to ensure safety. He also personally approached the affected residents to reassure them. Everything's under control, he said calmly. We'll continue patrolling the area to ensure there's no further threat. Lucas's professionalism and dedication not only eased the residents' worries but also left a strong impression. Some even came forward to thank him, and the suspicious looks that had once been there now seemed more friendly. Among the crowd, Tom Williams silently observed. He saw how Lucas not only gave orders but also acted directly, and how everything was handled in the best possible way. The conflict inside him seemed to give way to recognition. As the crowd began to disperse, Tom walked over to Lucas. Johnson, he said, his voice low but no longer as cold as before. Thank you for what you did tonight. I think I misjudged you. Lucas turned, a slight surprise in his gaze but also sincerity. Thank you, Mr. Williams. I'm just doing what I think is right, but I truly appreciate your words. Tom nodded, saying nothing more, but his eyes had softened as he turned to leave. Sarah appeared beside him, smiling with pride. I think you're starting to understand now, right? She asked. Tom didn't directly reply, but his eyes reflected agreement. Maybe this young man isn't as bad as I thought. That evening, when Lucas returned home, Grace was waiting for him at the door. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Lucas smiled, nodding. "All good. I think this is a big step for both me and this neighborhood." Grace embraced him, her eyes filled with pride. "You did so well, Lucas. You've shown that you not only belong here but can make it better." Lucas looked out the window, the streetlights casting their glow over the now quiet street. In his heart, a sense of hope filled him. Though the road ahead was still long, he knew he was headed in the right direction, not just to change prejudices, but to build a truly united community. Here's the continuation. The event where Lucas led the police team to resolve the break-in became a turning point for Oakwood Lane. The residents who had once been suspicious of him began to reconsider their views. They no longer saw Lucas as a threat or an outsider but as an indispensable part of the neighborhood. A few days later, at the regular community meeting in the neighborhood hall, the atmosphere was more lively than usual. Those who had previously only listened in silence now started offering their opinions and suggestions. Lucas stood at the head of the table, taking careful notes and answering each question in detail. Mrs. Mary Smith was the first to speak. "I just want to say that Lucas's presence has changed the way we think about this community. I'm very grateful for his efforts in maintaining security and building unity." Applause erupted from the residents, and even those who had kept their distance before began nodding in agreement. Lucas could feel the noticeable shift in people's attitudes, and it gave him a sense of renewed strength. At the back of the room, Tom Williams quietly watched. He had come to previous meetings reluctantly, but now, what Lucas had done made it impossible for him to deny the effectiveness of his leadership. Tom knew he had been wrong, and his pride no longer allowed him to avoid the truth. As the meeting was nearing its end, Tom stood up, drawing the attention of everyone. "I want to say a few words," he began, his voice low but firm. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. Tom took a deep breath, as though gathering his courage. "I must admit that when Lucas and his family first moved in, I had preconceived notions about them. I let my past and my fears cloud my judgment. But what Lucas has done, especially his dedication to maintaining the neighborhood's security, has made me rethink my views." Tom turned to Lucas, his gaze no longer cold but sincere. "Lucas, I want to apologize to you in front of everyone here. I was wrong to doubt you, and I'm very appreciative that you didn't give up. From now on, I want to be part of the positive changes you are bringing." Silence filled the room for a few seconds before applause erupted. Lucas felt a wave of emotion welling up inside him. He walked over to Tom, extending his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Williams. I truly appreciate these words. We are all here for a common goal, to make this community a better place." The handshake between Lucas and Tom was not just a reconciliation between two individuals but a symbol of the change in the way the entire community viewed each other. The remaining residents began clapping louder, with many standing to show their support. After the meeting, Tom stayed behind, actively participating in discussions about future plans for the neighborhood. He suggested organizing a social event for all the families in the area, where people could share their stories and clear up any remaining misunderstandings. Sarah, his daughter, smiled proudly as she saw her father finally opening up. Lucas, along with Grace and Emily, also actively participated in preparing for the event. They felt this was an opportunity to bring everyone together, regardless of age, race, or perspective. The social event took place a week later in the neighborhood's Central Park. Families brought food and drinks, and the warm atmosphere filled every corner. Children played while adults chatted and shared their stories. Lucas walked through the crowd, feeling the sense of unity that had once seemed impossible. Mrs. Mary Smith caught sight of him and said, "You've done it, Lucas. This neighborhood is no longer the same, it has become better because of you." Lucas smiled, looking around. He saw Tom happily chatting with a group of residents he had previously kept his distance from. Sarah stood nearby, her eyes shining with pride. That evening, as the family returned home, Lucas sat on the porch, looking at the street. It was now warmer and more welcoming than ever. Grace placed her hand on his shoulder, smiling. "You did it, Lucas. They not only accepted you but also trusted you." Lucas nodded, his eyes filled with hope. I've just done what I thought was right. But maybe the right thing I did was not giving up. Grace smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. On the quiet road of Oakwood Lane, the streetlights shone brightly, symbolizing a new beginning where prejudice was replaced with understanding and true unity. Here's the continuation. In the weeks following the social event, Oakwood Lane took on a new atmosphere. Friendly greetings replaced the cold stares of the past, and street conversations were no longer hesitant. Lucas could feel the change, not just in people's attitudes, but in how the community functioned. Community meetings became more lively, bringing forward many positive initiatives. One weekend afternoon, Lucas sat on his porch watching Emily play with the neighborhood children. Their laughter echoed down the street as they ran around freely, their friendships bridging any barriers that had once existed. Grace came out with 2 glasses of lemonade and sat next to Lucas, smiling. "Look, everything is going in the right direction." Lucas nodded, his eyes glowing with satisfaction. "Yes, but we can't stop. This work isn't just about building a harmonious community, it's about maintaining it." Grace squeezed his hand, her smile gentle. "I believe that with you, it's entirely possible." That evening, a barbecue was held at Mary Smith's house, with nearly all the residents of the neighborhood attending. Long tables were set up, piled high with grilled meats, snacks, and desserts, while laughter and cheerful chatter filled the air. Lucas and his family arrived early, bringing a salad that Grace had prepared. At the party, Tom Williams approached Lucas, holding a glass of water. His demeanor had softened, his once hesitant eyes now held warmth. "Lucas," Tom began, his voice firm but no longer cold. "I just want to say that I truly appreciate what you've done for this neighborhood. You've not only excelled as a sheriff but also as a respected neighbor." Lucas smiled, extending his hand to shake Tom's. "Thank you, Mr. Williams. But I think we all contributed to this change." Tom nodded, a hint of pride in his gaze. "And I also want to thank Sarah. If it weren't for her, I might not have opened up." Standing nearby, Sarah smiled and walked over to her father. "You did great, Dad. I'm proud of you." Later that evening, everyone gathered around a small fire in the backyard of Mary's house. Emily sat on Lucas's lap, her eyes bright as she listened to the funny stories the residents shared. Mary reminisced about the early days of her move to Oakwood Lane, while younger residents discussed plans for the next neighborhood event. For the first time in years, Tom joined the conversation comfortably. He even suggested organizing a gardening class, an idea that everyone enthusiastically supported. As the party ended, Lucas watched as people began to leave. Sarah turned to him, her eyes filled with respect. "Thank you, Lucas. Without you, this community couldn't have changed like this." Lucas smiled and replied, "It's all of us who've made it happen. But I'm glad to see that people are ready to change." Returning home, Lucas sat on the porch, his eyes looking out over the street, now full of life. Grace came out, sat beside him, and wrapped her arm around his shoulder. "You've done it, Lucas," she said softly. He nodded, his gaze distant but hopeful. "We've done it. But this journey has just begun. The important thing is to keep this community growing." Grace smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "With you here, I believe it's entirely possible." On the quiet road of Oakwood Lane, the streetlights illuminated not only the present but also the future. A harmonious, united community was forming. Lucas knew he hadn't just found a home for his family but a place where everyone could build a better future together. The story of Lucas Johnson and his efforts to build a united community in Oakwood Lane shows us that understanding and patience can change any prejudice. From a neighborhood full of suspicion, Oakwood Lane became a place where everyone could live together harmoniously and closely.